Hello and welcome. I am Thomas Porteous and you're watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. The US Special Envoy for Syria called for all sides to step back and hold dialogue after deadly clashes with Druze factions and Israeli strikes in Damascus. Turkey also condemned Israel's attacks on Syria's army HQ, calling them a sabotage of efforts to restore peace and stability in the war-torn country. 20 Palestinians were killed at an aid distribution point run by the US-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. 19 were trampled and 1 stabbed after armed agitators sparked a crowd surge, according to reports. The UN Rights Office says it has recorded at least 875 deaths near Gaza aid sites in the past 6 weeks. Israel said it is deploying more troops to the Syrian border after warning Damascus to pull back forces from the south. The Israeli military said it made the move in accordance with the situational assessment and vowed more strikes if demands are not met. A senior Hamas official has dismissed claims of progress in Gaza ceasefire talks, saying Israel has not provided any new maps on troop withdrawals. Bassem Naim accused Israel of seeking to prolong military control in the Palestinian territory. US President Trump is considering new disclosures and a special prosecutor to contain backlash over files linked to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Trump has backed Pam Bondi and has urged his supporters to move on, but some key allies remain defiant. Russia has launched 400 drones and a missile overnight to Ukraine, striking energy infrastructure and wounding at least 15 people across Kharkiv and other regions. Ukrainian officials earlier said 2 people were killed in a separate drone strike on the frontline city of Kupiansk. Iran's parliament said that Tehran should not resume nuclear negotiations with the United States until certain preconditions are met, state media reported. Lawmakers warned that Washington uses talks to deceive Iran and shield Israeli attacks, saying no new negotiations can occur until conditions are fulfilled. A war monitor says at least 248 people have died in southern Syria's Swida province, days after clashes that forced a government troop deployment. The Syrian Observatory says 92 Druze minority members were among the dead, including 28 civilians and 21 allegedly executed by government forces. Now for our top story, we start in the Middle East, where deadly clashes in southern Syria have claimed at least 300 lives, according to monitors, with 1 dead, 18 wounded in Israeli strikes on Damascus. The city of Swida, a Druze stronghold, has seen heavy fighting. Israel has warned Syrian government troops to withdraw from the area. Israel is also warning the Syrian regime of what it called painful blows if attacks on Druze civilians continue. New Israeli airstrikes have hit areas near Syria's military headquarters in the Syrian capital. State TV reported strikes near the presidential palace. A footage from Al Jazeera has surfaced where you can see, while the reporter was reporting, there was massive blasts right behind him. Now let's in fact take a look at that.
شباب في عندنا قصف، شباب قصف يا شباب خذونا على الهواء، شباب قصف بسرعة، بسرعة يا شباب خذونا على اللايف. قصف هيئة الأركان. يا شباب قصف خذونا بسرعة بسرعة.
إذا استهدافنا من هيئة الأركان بشكل كامل.
قصف ثاني. دمروه.
منتصر صوتك على الهواء.
قصف هيئة الأركان بغارتين. نعم.
Yes, some truly compelling visuals there. We're now joined by Professor Ephraim Imbar, who's a senior researcher at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. He joins us live from Jerusalem to discuss this further. Professor Imbar, thank you very much for joining us on the programme, first of all. I just want to get your initial reactions to the way that this situation has escalated. We've just seen within the past hour or so visuals of that strike on the Syrian capital. What are the thoughts in Israel right now?
I think that escalation is in southern Syria when government forces invaded the Druze city and started a pogrom, killing indiscriminately, raping women. Those forces are basically the jihadists of the regime. And this is to be deplored. And unfortunately, the world doesn't pay attention to murderous activities by the proxies of the regime, of the Syrian regime.
Yes, Professor Imbar. A lot of people, a lot of critics, international critics are coming out and saying that this risks some serious escalation in the region. Turkey has come out and called the Israeli strikes on the military HQ in particular sabotage. There were hopes of Syria becoming a democratic nation. What are your thoughts on the critics who are saying that Israel's strikes and military action in Syria are a real risk of causing serious regional instability here?
I think those hopes are terribly unfounded. This is typical Western optimism that has no basis. Where in the Arab world do we have a democratic regime? Believing that Ashara, a former jihadist, will bring about a democratic regime to Syria is such hope is messianic. I cannot believe that serious people entertain such hopes.
Yes, and Professor Imbar, Israeli officials have warned Syria of, quote, painful blows following the Druze attacks, which have now, monitors have said, have claimed over 300 lives there, not all of which were Druze, but 92 of which have been confirmed as being so. Do you not think this rhetoric risks escalating a local security issue into a full-blown regional conflict? And if so, how do you think it should be moderated?
I think Israeli strikes at regime installations try to contain the terrible behavior of the regime forces. And I think the world should applaud that what Israel is doing in order not to repeat in Sueda, in Jabal Druze, in southern Syria, what happened on October 7 by similar jihadists, the Hamas. So the pressure should be on the Syrian government that suddenly becomes the darling of the Western world for reasons which I do not fully understand. And this is, I think, the address for stopping further escalation.
Yes,
Israel is simply trying to defend the Druze community in southern Syria. The Druze in Israel are a close ally of the Israeli government. They serve in the Israeli military. They are Israeli citizens. And it is their relatives that are being murdered with no mercy in southern Syria.
Yes, we've obviously seen reports of Druze people coming over the border or attempting to come over the border between Syria and Israel, crossing from Israel into Syria. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has warned against this. He's urged Israel's Druze community not to cross into Syria, warning of kidnappings and killings. How do you reconcile this with Israel's obligation to protect this minority group that has historically served in its armed forces, as you have said?
I think the Israeli government is trying to minimize the dangers to its Druze citizens that cross the border hoping that they'll reach Sweden and help their Druze brethren, because we understand that if they fall hostages in the hand of the jihadists, they might be murdered, they might be taken hostages, creating additional problems for Israel. So we try to instill some sense into their heads and to allow the Israeli military to try to defend the Druze rather than citizens, which I'm not sure they have weapons with them. And it's an attempt to protect our own citizens.
Yes, indeed. But Professor Imbar, how does Israel navigate international law and United Nations resolutions when it comes to conducting these cross-border strikes? What mechanisms exist to ensure accountability for potential civilian casualties? I mean, we've seen these strikes here. They are substantial, especially those ones that we've just played the visual of. What are your thoughts? What mechanisms do exist to ensure accountability for potential civilian casualties in the Syrian capital?
I think we are more concerned about the Druze in the south than the Syrians in Damascus. But war is never surgical. There are always some kind of collateral damage. I think that Israeli military, through precision strikes, tries to minimize as much as possible collateral damage. But this is part of war. War is not a picnic.
Are you calling this a potential war then, Professor Imbar?
War is use of force and trying to exact pain from the enemy. This is what war is. And if you have a war, this is what happens.
Okay,
it's not a game.
No, of course. Syrian forces have deployed in Sweden and installed checkpoints near the border. What impact do you think Israel's recent strikes will have on the local Syrian population? How do you think that they will be feeling, both reeling from these strikes and also ideologically, and on these cross-border humanitarian operations?
We are doing our best to help the Druze establish the hospital in their vicinity. We are accepting their wounded and we treat them in Israel. We do our best to make the life of the Druze in the south as nice as possible under the difficult conditions when in Damascus there is a quasi-jihadi regime, and some of the units that they are sending south, they pretend not to have control. It's not me, it's them. And so, and maybe it's true. Maybe it's true that Ashara doesn't have control over all the lunatics that are in Syria.
Yes, Professor Imbar, you are staying with us to discuss further updates in regards to this situation. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is urging members of the Druze community not to cross into Syria. He warned they risk being killed or kidnapped and could disrupt IDF operations. This comes after dozens already crossed the border amid escalating violence in Syria's Sweda region. Let's have a look at what the Israeli Prime Minister said about the situation.
אנחנו פועלים גם בסוריה היום, מהבוקר. יש לנו מחויבות לשמור על אזור דרום מערב סוריה כשטח מפורז בגבול ישראל. אנחנו לא נרשה לחזור למצב שמקיימים לנו שם לבנון שנייה. ואנחנו גם מחויבים לשמור על התושבים הדרוזים. אנחנו עושים זאת באמצעות פעולות עצימות. אני מקווה שלא נצטרך לפעול יותר. זה תלוי מאוד במה שמבינים וגם עושים וגם לא עושים.
Syrian security forces have been deployed across Sweden, setting up checkpoints and inspecting vehicles. Israel's Foreign Minister Gideon Saar says Israel will defend its interests in Syria, including protecting the Druze community. He condemned what he called murder and pogroms against minorities. Let's have a look at what the Israeli Foreign Minister said.
אנחנו רואים פה תופעה שחוזרת על עצמה, של התנכלות למיעוטים עד כדי רצח ופוגרומים בסוריה. לפעמים זה כוחות המשטר, לפעמים זה מיליציות ג'יהאדיסטיות שהם הבייס שלהם. אם המשטר בדמשק לא יתעשת על עצמו, הוא בסופו של דבר יתרחק מכל היעדים המרכזיים שהוא הציב לעצמו, ובראשם משילות והשגשוג הכלכלי. ולכן טוב שתהיה התעשתות והשבת הסדר על כאן.
International reactions are now mounting after Israel strikes in Syria. The US envoy for Syria is urging all sides to step back amid escalating violence in the south. Marco Rubio says he hopes to provide updates soon on the situation. Turkey has condemned the airstrikes in Damascus, calling them a sabotage of Syria's efforts to restore peace, stability and security in the region. Tensions remain high as civilians caught in the crossfire brace for what may come next. We're now once again joined by Professor Imbar to discuss this in further detail. I first of all want to start on the United States response and the possibility and what possible reaction they might have to this, Professor Imbar, as Donald Trump, not even a month ago, lifted sanctions on Syria to say, quote unquote, give them a chance at greatness. What do you think is going to be the United States' reaction to this kind of hostility that is now escalating? We've seen the US envoy for Syria react and say, and asking both sides to step back in their conflict. What are your thoughts in how President Trump and the United States will respond to this escalating violence?
I think that the United States decision to cancel the sanctions on Syria were premature. I think it would have been better to test this regime for a while, if it indeed is a peace-loving regime, and if it doesn't use jihadists at its disposal to create havoc in the areas populated primarily by minorities such as the Kurds or the Druze in Syria, and to restrain some of those Islamic impulses that are very intolerant of minorities. This, I think, we should have waited to see the regime act in a more responsible manner. Unfortunately, it was not done, but it's not too late to make sure that new regimes that wants to get close to the West to prove that it is a responsible regime and is not using the words of democracy in order to butcher the minorities in Syria.
Professor Imbar, there's been some condemnation from Israeli officials in condemning the attacks on the Druze community and other minorities as murder and pogroms. What specific evidence is there of this, of Syrian state complicity here?
I think that, of course, I'm not privy to intelligence, Israeli intelligence, but think tanks in southern Syria, I don't think the jihadists have control, no militias have control of tanks. The tanks are the tanks of the regime. And he doesn't claim they were kidnapped by militias. So it's quite clear that this is a governmental action that has cannot be tolerated. To send tanks into a city to butcher people without any concern about collateral damage. They are looking for collateral damage. The civilians are the target, just like Hamas. It's a population-centric strategy used by the regime in order to bring fear into the minority and to subdue them. This is the strategy of the government, of the Shara government.
Yes, Professor Imbar, I'm going to address something for our viewers. We're currently running visuals right now of the Israel-Syria border fence. As you can see, the Druze community there is gathering at the barbed wire fence which separates Israel and Syria. But as we've heard previously, Benjamin Netanyahu has condemned and advised all Druze people who want to go and cross over from Israel into Syria, and he has very much spoken against that warning of killing and kidnapping if they do cross. But as you can see, a number of Druze community members there waiting at that border fence. Professor Imbar, I want to come back to you now. Gideon Saar has said that Israel will always protect its interests in Syria. What exactly are those interests, if you don't mind telling our viewers?
I think Israel made clear its interest. It wants southern Lebanon to be demilitarized. And so there will be no danger to the Druze, and of course, no danger to Israel that borders that area. This is the Israeli clear national security interest. We don't want terrorists along our borders.
Yes. Professor Imbar, thank you very much for joining us on the program. We will bring you all updates from that ongoing and developing situation as soon as we get them. Now we move over to Europe, where the French and German finance ministers have urged the United States to hold serious and targeted talks to reach a fair agreement in the US-EU tariff dispute. This comes after the European Union accused the United States of resisting to crack a deal with the United States. The European Union has also come forward warning of countermeasures if no agreement is reached between the United States and the European Union. Trump, meanwhile, said he was open to further discussions with the EU and other trading partners before new 30% tariffs kick in next month, and that EU officials would be coming to the United States for negotiations. Trump stepped up his trade war on Saturday, saying he would impose a 30% tariff on most imports from the EU and Mexico next month, following similar warnings for other countries, including Asian economic powerhouses, Japan and South Korea. The EU has so far held off on retaliatory measures to avoid a spiraling tit-for-tat escalation, while there remains a chance of negotiating an improved outcome. Let's in fact listen to what the German Minister for Finances said.
Wir sind uns einig darin, dass der Zollkonflikt beendet werden soll, dass es nicht hilft, wenn wir jetzt täglich neue Drohungen oder Provokationen erleben. Wir wollen ernsthafte und zielgerichtete Verhandlungen mit den USA. Dafür stehen Deutschland und Frankreich, dafür stehen wir in der Europäischen Union. Wir Europäer sind geschlossen und wir sind entschlossen. Wir wollen einen fairen Deal mit den Amerikanern, aber klar ist,
We're now joined by John Rossomando, who's the president of Viking Research Associates and a geopolitical analyst. He joins us live from Washington, D.C. John, thank you very much for coming and joining us on the program. John, the European Union, a huge trading bloc, a huge trading partner for the United States. They have until August the 1st, and there remains hope that the deal may still be negotiated. However, the European Union has said that retaliatory measures will be prepared in the in this situation where a 30% tariff is in fact posed on the bloc of 27 countries. What are your thoughts about the current relationship between the Trump administration? Is there hope here for a deal to be negotiated?
Well, it looks to me like the Europeans are digging in their heels, contrary to President Trump's desire for them to respond by lowering tariffs, thus allowing American goods to become more available in the European market. So I think this will have a very, detrimental impact on relations.
Yes, and also there's been talks of upwards of $82 billion retaliatory measures back to the United States if this deal does come through. Do you think that has any deal-making power when it comes to threatening the possibility of these tariffs being imposed?
Well, I think that President Trump is pretty much determined to impose his tariffs, which are the core of his economic agenda and his effort to reduce the trade deficit the U.S. has with its trading partners.
Yes, and John, so international economists, American economists, European economists have all voiced their concern over these tariffs ever since they were first announced in April on that big board with Donald Trump in that Rose Garden. A lot of worries about it affecting the American consumer directly. What are your thoughts on that outlook?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that American consumers will pay more for imported goods. I think part of it is President Trump wants to encourage domestic manufacturers and encourage the growth of the domestic economy that he believes has been unfairly undermined by foreign imports.
Also, John, there's no doubt that this will not put a bit of a tinge in the relationship between the US and its also its closest allies as well. How might this US-EU tariff dispute affect transatlantic unity as a whole?
Well, I think that things are rather strained right now because Trump looks at the European Union as an adversary, not the way that prior administrations have looked at as part of the West and we're all friends kind of thing. I mean, President Trump also is concerned about free speech in the European Union, the censorship of populist parties. And I think that President Trump wants to hold the line against Europe, hoping that they will succeed.
What about the risks here, John? There's been talks that this tariff policy of Donald Trump could open opportunities to rivals like China or Russia, and that they could exploit Washington and Brussels if odds remain over trade. What are your thoughts on that, on the possibility of that happening?
Well, I'm not so much worried about the Russians. They don't have anything to sell other than oil and gas. However, China could use the opening to increase its influence in Europe and to increase the sale of Chinese goods on the European market.
Yes, exactly. And what extent does this tariff standoff signal a shift towards economic nationalism in both the US and in Europe? And what are the long-term ramifications of this?
Well, I think that the shift is more on the American side. I mean, President Trump ran on an anti-globalist platform, and that's what his voters want. I mean, you have allies of Trump, say in Hungary with Viktor Orban, the populist prime minister of Hungary. But I think that this will encourage further drifting away between the U.S. and Europe under Trump's rule. I mean, governance.
Do you think this is what the American people voted for, though, John? I mean, you've had a lot of allies, including Elon Musk when the two billionaires were still friends. Do you think this is what the American people voted for, a trade policy like this?
Well, I think that the American people who voted for Donald Trump wanted economic nationalism. They wanted an America, first. That's President Trump's slogan. They believe that the World Economic Forum that has personified the integration between the U.S. and Europe for the past 50 years has undermined the American economy and made Americans less well off. So I think that, yes, this is what Americans voted for.
Okay, and how do you think these prolonged negotiations impact NATO defence contributions and cooperation on global crisis, with that of the European Union, which obviously is one of the United States' closest allies?
Well, let's look at it this way. President Trump, the NATO defense ministers recently agreed to a 5% GDP of defense spending. That wouldn't have happened without Donald Trump. I mean, most of the NATO militaries are in a state of either lack of readiness, disrepair. I mean, you just recently had the Germans announce that they're buying 7,000 armored vehicles from Rheinmetall Corporation. That would not have happened without Donald Trump putting pressure on Europe to take up the slack for its own defense.
John Rossomando, thank you very much for joining us on the programme. Always a pleasure to have your insight here. We now move over to Europe, where as the conundrum over the Russia-Ukraine ceasefire continues, the Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Andriy Sybiha, has said that Ukraine is ready for more peace talks with Russia. However, he did not reveal a specific date for talks. He reiterated Kiev's call for a meeting between Russian and Ukrainian leaders, saying it would be the most effective step to help agree to a ceasefire. As per reports, Ukrainian Foreign Minister also further repeated his warnings that Europe needs to face the threat of Russia and urging the EU to adopt further sanctions against Moscow. Let's in fact listen in to what the Ukrainian Foreign Minister had to say.
Було б добре, якби в цій зустрічі взяли участь і інші лідери, передусім президент Трамп, наші європейські колеги, президент Ердоган. І ми вважаємо, що саме така зустріч може дати якісну зміну щодо досягнення передусім перемир'я на суші, морі, в повітрі.
This came as plenary talks between the foreign ministers of Poland, Ukraine and Lithuania took place today to mark the 5th anniversary of the creation of the Lublin Triangle. Okay, we're now joined by Sander van Hoorn, who is a former EU correspondent. He joins us live from Amsterdam. Thank you very much for joining us, Sander. What are your thoughts on the current state of this conflict? Is there any optimism of future talks, future direct talks, and any credible possibility that peace negotiations will move forward? Previously, we've seen 2 prisoner swaps from the direct talks between Russia and Ukraine. Is there any optimism of anything further going on here?
Swaps, I wouldn't get my hopes up too high. Of course, we have the Donald Trump 50-day deadline until tariffs are imposed. Not clear what tariffs he was talking about, but we will have to see if that puts some pressure on the negotiations. However, the key sticking points are still there. Basically, Russia wants to keep the territories it holds right now, and maybe even more, and Ukraine does not want that. So it's also about questions like to what extent is Ukraine demilitarized? To what extent is it allowed to reach out to EU and NATO? Those are all things that still have to be hashed out. And I think up until the moment that that becomes a reality, the 2 leaders will not meet. They were supposed to meet a little over a month ago in Istanbul, Turkey, but that meeting has not happened. So I don't really see any reason for optimism right now.
Sander, I apologise. Please stay with us. We will come back to this story. However, we have some breaking news coming out of the Middle East coming in. A new ceasefire has been agreed in Syria's Druze majority city of Sweda, according to the Interior Ministry. The truce comes after days of intense violence that killed over 300 people. The deal includes deployment of security checkpoints across the city. The announcement follows a previous truce collapse just a day earlier. State media says authorities hope the move will help restore calm and avoid further bloodshed. However, skepticism remains over how long this latest ceasefire will hold in the face of growing tensions and pressure from both sides in the region. Just wanted to repeat that breaking news there. A ceasefire has been agreed in the southern Syrian city and Druze majority city of Sweden, and we will bring you all updates in regards to that ongoing situation. Sander, apologies for that. I wanted to come back to you now. To what extent do you think these direct leader-level talks between Putin and Zelensky could accelerate a lasting ceasefire, given the current dynamics, these escalating aerial strikes mainly that we see striking the civilian cities of Ukraine? Today we saw drone strikes in Kharkiv as well as other cities across Ukraine. What are your thoughts on the possibility of diplomacy here?
Look, this is what Ukrainians, I've been there many times during the war, they will tell you that this is nothing new. Putin does not want a ceasefire, he wants all of Ukraine. And they say we've seen it after we reached a ceasefire after the Crimea invasion. Putin came back. So if there is a ceasefire now, we want to have security guarantees that he will not withdraw, regroup, learn their lessons to be learned and come back after a couple of years to take Kyiv. So there's like this skepticism among Ukrainians about any ceasefire talks not offering guarantees for the long-term stability of Ukraine. So that remains a sticking point. And until sticking points as big as this arise, I don't see any meeting between the two leaders yield any success. And now with the announcement of Donald Trump supplying Patriot missiles, I think the incentive for Ukraine has become a little bit less to engage in talks that do not offer those security guarantees in the end.
Sander, we've just heard from Ukraine's foreign minister urging the European Union for further sanctions in compelling Russia. How effective do you think this will be to bring Moscow to the negotiating table and to push negotiations towards a ceasefire further?
Well, it's the 18th sanctions package of the European Union, and so far it hasn't really harmed the Russian economy. It hasn't brought Russia to the negotiation table. So you can wonder if this will bring, it will, however, signal Moscow that the European Union is still able to make unified decisions on sanctions towards Moscow, so that it's still Moscow has not succeeded in dividing the European countries. Slovakia was the last country in the European Union to block this package, but apparently they have yielded their resistance to this package. So yeah, it's a signal of unity, but it will not bring the conflict to an end sooner than without this package, I think.
Yes, Sander, and of course yesterday we saw the announcement of Donald Trump giving a 50-day deadline and the possibility of US enforcing sanctions on some of Moscow's closest trading allies. How effective do you think those ones will be? And what do you think of the 50-day deadline that Donald Trump has imposed?
Well, in Ukraine and also in some European countries, they worry that this signal of those 50 days might be interpreted by Moscow to keep on bombing, at least with impunity, for the next 50 days. So that's the worry here. And the people wonder what those sanctions Donald Trump is talking about, what they might entail. So there's a lot of like ambiguity, a lot of uncertainty there. What you see now also with the Ukrainians saying that they are ready to negotiate is kind of like the blame game. They don't want to be seen by Donald Trump as the ones blocking for negotiations on a peace deal. So I would think that in the days to come, you would see Russia also taking the stance like we're ready to negotiate because they don't want to be seen by Donald Trump as well as the one blocking a peace deal. So it's more, I think, about appearances than that countries are actually hoping to negotiate in any serious matter anytime soon.
Sander, what strategic or political factors do you think might be driving Moscow's reluctance to commit to a specific date for these renewed talks? And how should Kiev adjust its diplomatic approach in response?
To the 50-day deadline of Donald Trump, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I think the first step we have already seen. They are telling Donald Trump, look, we're ready anytime that negotiations are scheduled. We will be there, we will negotiate. That's the basic level of diplomacy that Kiev has to do, like not being in Donald Trump's crosshairs as they have been before. They are quite happy right now that they at least get new Patriot systems paid for by the Europeans to defend themselves against Russian missile and drone attacks. So they don't want to lose that support. They don't want to have Donald Trump look more towards Putin in the days to come. So they will have to keep playing this game and basically see if Russia will change its stance in the negotiations, if they want to, for example, compromise on the areas they hold so far. And that remains to be seen, if those basic differences between the two countries, if they can be breached in the short term, because otherwise those 50 days will pass without anything happening. And then the world is going to look at Donald Trump, where he places the blame and what action he will attach to that.
Sander van Hoorn, thank you very much for your insight and joining us on the programme. It's been a pleasure having you. We now move over to the Indo-Pacific next, where China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has expressed strong support for Iran's right to protect its sovereignty and dignity. Meeting with Tianjin with Iranian Foreign Minister Sayed Abbas Araghchi, Wang spoke about bullying and power politics. Wang emphasized the close partnership between China and Iran, highlighting their efforts to build trust and work together for long-term cooperation. Araghchi thanked China for its important support and praised China's leadership role in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They also addressed the sensitive issue of Iran's nuclear program. Araghchi made it clear that Iran does not want nuclear weapons, but insists on its right to use nuclear energy peacefully. He said Iran is ready to restart talks with all parties as long as there is fairness and respect. Wang welcomed Iran's peaceful stance and stressed that China opposes the use or threat of force. He said China is committed to helping create dialogue and promote peace and stability in the Middle East. We're now joined by Professor Madhav Nalaput, who's the editor of the Sunday Guardian. He joins us live from New Delhi. Professor Nalaput, thank you very much for joining us. What are your thoughts about these talks between Tehran and Beijing and their foreign ministers? How do you see this relationship?
Look, I'd like to say very clearly that so far as China is concerned, it is friendly with all countries that are hostile to the United States, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Iran, whether it is any other country. Frankly, Pakistan is objectively hostile to the United States, but I think there are people in the United States who continue to be bamboozled into believing that Pakistan is other than what it is, which is a Chinese satellite. So far as Iran is concerned, China would like to support Iran, there's no question about it. But if I may ask, I mean, I don't see why someone should not question the Chinese on this point, that the ruling party in Iran essentially the Khamenei, the supreme leader, and the IRGC, the civilian government, is very weak, as is the case in Pakistan. But the reality is, they do not accept the right of Jewish people to exist. They do not accept the right of Israel as a state and the Jewish people as a faith to exist. So in that situation, I mean, what is China doing? Supporting a side that does not recognize the right of the Jewish people to their own lives, to their very lives, and to the recognition of the state of Israel, who are opposed to that. A state which is recognized by the United Nations, which is the only Jewish state, a Jewish country in the world. And I think the Jews have earned the right to have their country, judging by the terrible price they have paid in the Holocaust in the previous century, and judging by the horror that was inflicted on them on the October 7th Hamas attack. So please, please, Mr. Bongi, please make your position clear on that. What do you think about the insistence by your good friends that Israel does not have the right to exist as a state, and the Jewish people do not have the right to exist as a people? What do you have to say about that?
Professor Nalaput, Iran is actually home to the second largest Jewish population in the Middle East. It was in 2021, 8,500 Jews still do live in Iran. Yes, Iran has said, Iran calls Israel occupied Palestine. However, those statements, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, 8,000 people is what a large apartment block would have. If anyone thinks that's a large number of people compared to a thriving Jewish community that was there before the clerics took over, well, then that individual is welcome to believe so. But it's frankly, it would fill only a single large multi-story apartment block, and not a very, very large, very multi-story apartment block either. It's a very tiny number, and they're there on sufferance, and they know it, and they have to keep repeating praises of the clerics, the very clerics who they know oppose their faith and oppose the state of Israel, to which they have a right to return. If the Iranians are so generous, why not allow these 8,000 and odd Jews to emigrate to Israel, where they'll be welcomed with open arms? I mean, that's the obvious question that I think people need to ask.
Yes, Professor Nalaput, thank you very much for joining us. China is pushing back against criticism from US politicians over its role in the United Nations. Foreign Ministry spokesman Lin Juan said Washington should view China and bilateral ties objectively and rationally. Speaking in Beijing, Lin responded to claims about China's growing UN influence. He called the remarks ideologically biased and a product of a Cold War zero-sum mentality. Lin said China firmly opposes such thinking. He also urged the US to take concrete steps to foster stable and healthy relations rather than escalate tensions through rhetoric and confrontation. The comments highlight deepening strains in US-China diplomatic engagement. Let's have a look at what the Foreign Ministry spokesperson said.
反映出美国一些政客典型的意识形态偏见和冷战零和思维。中方对此坚决反对。我们敦促美方客观理性看待中国和中美关系，以实际行动推动中美关系稳定、健康、可持续发展，而不是相反。
We're now joined by Professor Madhav Nalaput once again to discuss this further. Professor Nalaput, how does China's defence of its UN influence reflect Beijing's broader ambitions for a reformed global governance order?
Well, look, the fact of the matter is that the CCP top leadership, I'm not talking about the Chinese people, They got an extremely wonderful, vibrant tradition of thousands of years, and they have exceptional qualities as a people. I'm not even talking about the CCP. I'm not even talking about the top rung of the CCP, but the very highest rung of the CCP. And as far as they are concerned, I mean, what is their definition of objective? Their definition of objective is to be, frankly, subjective, to basically do what the Chinese CCP top leadership wants you to do, flood the markets with goods and take more, nibble at territory and basically do nothing about it. But the fact is, we are now in this era, the era of Cold War 2.0. And in this era, there is an existential conflict that is raging, as existential as was the conflict with the Soviet Union and the democracies in the past. That is a conflict between the authoritarian system, represented especially by the topmost rung of the leadership of the CCP. That Cold War is a reality of life. It cannot be ignored. And the objective reasons for that war. The reason is that the Chinese want to display, the Chinese Communist Party leadership, I will say shorthand the Chinese, they want to replace the US with themselves as the primary power. And that will mean the collapse of the US dollar. It will mean a very rapid decline in the US economy, and the US will fall, will have a precipitous fall in living standards. So the fact of the matter is, their idea of objective is for the US to be doing, basically looking at them as they would want you to look at themselves. I mean, in the case of other countries, they basically tell you be objective, which means we may nibble at your territory. We may hold large areas of a territory, but don't worry about that. You know, you be satisfied with what you have until we take more. And I wouldn't call this being objective at all. So that definition of objectivity is something to be desired.
Professor Madhav Nalapat, thank you very much for joining us on the programme. Pleasure, as always. We now move over to Europe for our next story, where British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer says serious questions remain over a damaging Afghan data leak. Speaking in Parliament, he welcomed a Defence Committee inquiry. Starmer also expressed concern over Gaza civilian deaths, urging Israel to act with accountability, but stopped short of supporting sanctions against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Let's have a look at what the British Prime Minister had to say today.
There's always been support across this House for the United Kingdom fulfilling our obligations to Afghans who served alongside British forces. We warned in opposition about Conservative management of this policy, and yesterday the Defence Secretary set out the full extent of the failings that we inherited. A major data breach, a super injunction, a secret route that has already cost hundreds of millions of pounds. Ministers who served under the party opposite have serious questions to answer about how this was ever allowed to happen. The chair of the Defence Committee has indicated that he intends to hold further inquiries.
We now move on once again. Diageo CEO Deborah Crew has stepped down immediately with no reason given. Her exit comes amid financial pressures, including US tariffs and weak sales in Latin America. CFO Nick Jangani takes over as interim CEO. The company, known for Guinness and Johnny Walker, recently reported a 13% drop in profits. It plans to cut costs by $500 million over 3 years. Despite challenges, Diageo says its outlook for the next financial year remains unchanged. Now we move on once again. Wildfires in Turkey have contained 6 of 9 wildfires raging over Izmir province. Strong winds and faulty power lines fueled the blazes, which killed 2 people and forced mass evacuations. Aerial teams, over 1,100 vehicles, continue to battle flames in Buca and Odamis. Turkey's forestry minister praised the forest heroes for their overnight efforts. The Izmir governor says shifting winds remain a major challenge. The region, like no other Mediterranean areas, is seeing more frequent and intense fires amid a changing climate. Well, that is all we have time for.